can we do to combat the rise in violence against Asians and other people of color in the US? We'll answer this question and more on Talking with Henrietta, coming up next. Hi, I'm Henrietta. Welcome to my show. Today on the show, I'll be talking with 4 guests, 2 of them a colleague, about the spike in hate crimes in the US and what we can do about them. I'll be talking with my very special guest, Connie Yu Young, who is a Chinese American writer, activist, historian, and lecturer. Then there's Michael Uwila, who's an East Palo Alto resident, activist, and frequent contributor to the East Palo Alto Today newspaper. And my 2 colleagues, Yuki Nishida and Tonga Victoria Fakalata. So thank you so much for being with us. Connie, let's start with you and talk about some of your background and some of the activities that you've had around combating anti-Asian hate.
Well, first of all, I'll talk about the fact that I've lived with the issue of anti-Asian hate all my life. I guess I'm the oldest person here. I was born in 1941 when the Chinese exclusion law was still in effect, which meant that my grandparents were not allowed to be naturalized citizens. There were the alien land laws. So my parents, well, they were very hopeful when I was born. So, but I've always known that I am here because my father's father came to San Jose at the age of 11, 1 year before the Chinese exclusion law, and therefore got here before the door was shut. And I know that my great grandfather on my mother's side was one of the workers on the Chinese railroad. I mean, he was one of the Chinese laborers on building the Transcontinental Railroad, uniting East and West, and was denied all the rights of citizenship and participated in American society, and the contributions were ignored. And then his daughter-in-law, that's my mother's mother, was detained on Angel Island for 15.5 months because she was an alien ineligible for citizenship, you know, coming back and forth. She married to a US citizen. And so I've had these stories all my life. So I don't see a spike in anti-Asian hate. I just feel that it's been, now we see contemporary incidents that are recorded and they're shown in the media, and thank goodness for that. And people are, are protesting. People have more clout to agitate against it. But
so Connie, are you saying what we see now has been with us from the early history that you just now shared?
Absolutely.
To the same degree.
To the same degree, in 2 years ago, San Jose, the city of San Jose issued an apology to Chinese residents for the burning of the Chinatown in May 4th, 1887, for anti-Chinese laws, for preventing a new Chinatown from being built, for harassing Chinese. So that was an apology acknowledging the past. And this came about because of the visibility of the anti-Asian hate, and the fact that we have to acknowledge the roots are very deep. The roots of racism are so deep, and we have to acknowledge the past in order to understand how people have these feelings about people of color being perpetual aliens, people of color being outside of American society. So I saw that resolution as a positive thing, and that this is the kind of thing that we can continue to do as community people to make connections between the past and the present, and to educate people to the fact that that anti-Asian laws, discriminatory ordinances, redlining has existed forever. Okay.
Yes. And then in San Francisco's early history, Chinese students couldn't sit beside white students in the classroom.
Absolutely.
Yes. Now you talked about educating. What kind of a job do you think we are currently doing with that educating that
Well,
needs to be done?
This has been, just when we think we're making some progress with the new administration, we have this incredible setbacks in other states about banning books and, talking about wokeism and the fact that finding out the past is harmful to the learning about racism of the past is harmful to the students today. They'll make them feel bad about themselves. So
especially the white students, right?
Well, that's what
Never mind that students of color have always been made to feel bad about themselves, right?
Exactly.
That they're not quite up to par.
Great. So I'd love to hear comments from others, from Mike and Tonga and Yuki. I mean,
yes, yes.
And
I was going to let them comment towards the end of the show or ask questions towards the end of the show, but since you've invited them to make comments and ask questions, certainly if there's anything they'd like to add. So Mike, since you are one of our guests on the show, and Yuki and Tonga Victoria are two of my colleagues, what comments might you like to make in terms of your experiences and what you think of the history that Connie just shared?
Well, well, thank you for having me. One of the things that I do recall, my parents were immigrants. My mother was from the island of Samoa, my father from the Kingdom of Tonga, and they migrated to the Bay Area in the early 70s. And at that time, the culture was extremely, civil rights was just coming out from the 60s to the 70s. There was this mass hysteria, kind of paranoia. We had like the Zodiac killer in the Bay Area. We had all this crazy stuff going on. We also had the Patty Hearst thing. And so the history of the Bay Area had all this, it was a very fertile ground for protesting. We had Berkeley, you had the Black Panther movement, you had a lot of, you had Stokely Carmichael was out here. And so the Pacific Islander, our little diaspora was like just a little seed, and it was still insular. We grew up in San Mateo, and so that area was, there were a lot of people from Hawaii there in Japan. And so we were already starting to be close to one another. And also there was a big African-American community around the King Center in San Mateo. So there was this sort of smorgasbord of, we weren't all one culture, but it was a bunch of cultures all trying to make it work in the county of San Mateo and San Francisco through the 70s and the 80s. And we had to survive by each other, relying on one another. And the churches were involved. So we had to find a church. So our community was more into the church and weren't really at the political forefront yet. We were still in the infant stage of migration to this country. And at that early stage, you're still like receptive, like, what is this? You're still curious. You don't really know what's racism. We didn't really know what that was. So when you're at that age, you just think, oh, this is how we're always going to be treated by white people. Maybe this is just how it's going to be. And until my mother, who was in her island in Samoa, they were colonialized. by the British, the New Zealand. So they knew what it was up. They were hip to it. They knew what was going on, but the Tongan community didn't know. So my father's side of the family didn't know that because they were never colonized. So if you're not colonized, you wouldn't know what that is. So that's another direction. And so I dealt with racism all my life and saw the hatred against Asians. I remember in school, they taught us about this Laundry Act in San Francisco. I don't know if you heard about that, where the laws were, since the Chinese was making so much money at laundry, they were like, well, you can't do laundry 24 hours. So they started making these rules, and that was the way they survived. And I was like, damn, is that a real thing? That sounds terrible. How can they make money if they're putting all these rules against them? And so that was some of the things that opened my eyes up. But that was like just like a little brief moment in history that they shared with us. And then we had to move on to like back to Washington, George Washington, and things like that.
Sure.
So-
Now, Michael, finish
Yes.
the sentence. Finish that sentence. You said so.
Well, so that's that when you only get that much of history, and then you get selection, and then you get older and you have choice. You
In
get
terms of what you can read and
and what you read and all of that. Whereas the school, they just like feed you stuff, and then you're like paying attention to some stuff, and then that's some of our education that we have. And then every once in a while they just, oh, here's a PBS special on Dr. King, and then that's all we have. And then at the same time, you got to go back to your own culture and make things work, and that could be either a blessing or a curse. It just depends on the person. Everybody's different.
sure. And Michael, I'd like to follow through after asking Connie, when did you become active, Connie? Can I say politically active? Or
Well, Mike actually evoked a lot of memories of this turbulent time. And for me, it came about during the Vietnam War, when it was a war against Asians. And you had images of Asians being killed and Asians, GIs,
called
and
Goops
the
and
names of,
and yes.
and the fact that the enemy, the North Vietnamese, were the Gooks, and they were also called Chinks, but all these A's, and it just brought to mind the past. But the main thing it did was it created dissent. There was organized dissent against the war, and people started associating the war with the ills of America. That, why are we fighting this war? Because, it's a really, besides being a war against communism, it's a racist war. You would not, the terrorism against people of color. So it was, well, I was very, very moved, of course, and shaken by the images that you saw on television. We saw that the war was televised. That was amazing
Yes,
to see,
yes.
Asian children being beaten. And I mean, they
And
actually
napalmed. I mean, we will always
Napalm.
remember that photo
Exactly.
of
The
this
girl
young
running down the road.
girl. Yes.
Napalm that was made by Dow Chemical in the United States. So as activists, we drew upon all of the past also, and the fact that there was so much racism in this country, and it was easier to fight at a war when you dehumanize the enemy by calling them names, and because they look so different. And so that really galvanized, and that was the beginning of the Asian American movement. And actually the term Asian American came about. Before it was Orientals, so and there were also coalitions, like Mike, you talk about people all being together. This is during the 60s, the radical groups would call it third world movement. Third world meaning all people of color. So it was a very exciting time as far as building solidarity of between people of color. So that was and I got involved with a radio program, KPFA. It was,
Yes.
I was a Chinese Youth Voice, and then Chinese for Affirmative Action. And then living here on the peninsula, I became one of the founders of Asian Americans for Community Involvement. And that's a very large service organization now, but it began as an affirmative action group. And that was started in 1973.
So tell me, you mentioned solidarity between groups and this idea of third world people of color. What happened to that solidarity? Does it still exist? Was there a breakdown? And if so, when?
The enormous breakdown, of course, was, when Trump was elected president. And so and suddenly, all of the, what lied beneath, came to surface. And what Trump did was empowered a white supremacist movement. And that divided people. And then during the COVID, during the pandemic, he used terms such as the Chinese virus or Kung Fu virus.
Yes, the
and
China
then
virus.
Terms,
Yes.
and then we started hearing terms, toward Asians like, go back to where you came from. And then the dividing of singling out Asians. And of course, there would be people from other backgrounds, Filipino, Thai, Cambodian, Vietnamese. They were all attacked as Chinamen, it's just like, because they caused the virus. So, and it was very, very disturbing because like in Oakland, a number of attacks were from African Americans on the Chinese or Asian population. And I really feel that was so encouraged by singling out the Chinese as an enemy, as causing the ills of society. So.
Yes, the media always kind of highlighted
Exactly.
African Americans attacking Asians.
Exactly.
However,
exactly.
What I've read is in terms of national figures, it's Caucasians who've attacked Asians the most. Now, I'm wondering this idea of the model minority, has that been harmful or helpful?
I think it's been harmful because it created jealousy. Like, oh, look at the image. Oh, look at how the Asians are so wealthy and they're taking jobs away from white people, which is pretty funny, actually. So yes, it's been very, very harmful. And also it made it seem as if we're so successful, what do we have to complain about? And that is a complete stereotype, a misconception. When you think about the struggling immigrant groups of Asian background that have come in, refugees from Southeast Asia, when they first came, they were not the model minority. And people will say, well, look at them now, they work so hard and they have their stores and they have this. And again, that is media, it's Fox News,
Yes. However, it's not media, and you can tell me whether it is or not in terms of the enrollment of Asian students at Berkeley. I mean, their enrollments have been so high that other Caucasians, for instance, are saying that they're being discriminated against.
I think that here you have a cultural divide here. And it is true that Asian parents, for the majority, they value education so much that's part of the upbringing of the children, that from the childhood on, that they're taught that they have to achieve and they have to be better than white people. They have to, because of the discrimination, and they have to help their parents and grandparents. So there's this cultural tradition, and I think that that's had an enormous effect. And that's true. I grew up, my parents were not like that. That's why I guess I'm different. They just said they were very, very, very different. They were very community minded. They just said, you have to be involved with the community. They've gone through so much, and they were very successful, but they just, they always said, do the best you can, you know. But I said they were different. It is true that my friends at Washington High School, their parents were struggling. Some of them worked in the laundry, and they said, look, you've got to study really hard. You know, you have to achieve, you have to get into to UC Berkeley. Certainly that was a big deal. And then later on, I mean, ideally Stanford University. And so anyway, I have no argument. I have no, it's very hard to talk about, you know, whether it's right for people to in affirmative action, because, you know, Chinese have succeeded so much. So why have affirmative action for people of color? So I just, it's a very difficult thing to talk about, but I believe in affirmative action.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, Yuki, Tonga Victoria, Michael, have you all been affected in terms of the stereotype of the model minority? Or has it been the opposite? I feel like saying, don't everyone answer at once?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Henrietta, for having and hosting this space. Connie, it's great to meet you, and La'ulu, Mike, it's always a pleasure to be in space with you to hear your thoughts and really just share conversation with you. As far as the model minority goes, no, I have not been a victim of that. I think it might have been kind of the opposite, given that I went to a high school where there were so many Polynesians, and we were known for, at least on the campus, for being the ones that started trouble, had poor retention rates, were suspended, excluded, expelled. And so I was up against kind of those stereotypes. And then also coming from the family that I came from, where education was a top priority and still is, having to kind of battle in between those two kind of expectations, one from the education system and one from my family. So that was what kind of the stereotypes that I had to deal with.
Sure. Yuki, coming from Saipan. Yes.
One thing for me personally that I think that the model minority myth really misses a lot is sort of the huge, it just thinks of Asians and Asian Americans as this monolith. And my experience has been very completely different. I'm first generation, I'm low income, and sort of this studious, successful, idea of an Asian person in America. It didn't really fit that mold for me in my environment growing up, mainly because I grew up in a very low income neighborhood, and Saipan and the Northern Mariana Islands is generally is a pretty low income place due to several systemic factors that I cannot get into. But my experience, when I came here to Boston, Massachusetts for college, I sort of interacted with what it means to be Asian American in Asian American spaces and here. And so a lot of the work that I did throughout college was actually fighting against the model minority myth and really thinking about the different narratives and the different experiences of what it means to be Asian American, and really just debunk it, just because I don't fit that mold, and I want to make sure that people understand that this has been manufactured to be a wedge against other races here in America.
You know, it's very interesting when you talk about manufactured to be a wedge. It seems like there is a concerted effort to keep certain barriers in place. Now, I guess one would have to say it's systemic. Is it simply the system?
Sometimes it's a choice. I mean, it's always a choice. People can decide what they want to do. Well, I'm going to start talking like this and try to sound proper all the damn time. And I'm like, well, where did that come from? What was and then it was like, why can't I just be myself? We talked about being, you know, as far as affirmative action. I've gotten jobs just because I was the only one that showed up by default that had a skin tone like this. And it didn't really matter. They were just like, well, we need a token minority here. Let's just use this guy. And I ended up being that guy, but I didn't look at it from that point of view. I was just looking at like, maybe I was just there to get a cup of coffee for free and just end up falling in a position where I was like, or my mother was like, oh yeah, he could do it. And I didn't even want to do it, but it was like, our parents look at it from a point of view, and then we have a point of view. I think in the Chinese, there's a proverb that one generation plants the trees and the other one gets the shade. And so we be like not knowing as the younger generation, but the older generation has a view, and then we have a view, and we got an angle and they got an angle. And sometimes they don't meet. And so that's like when you get older, finally, like I'm over 40, I'm starting to see like, wow, my mom and dad were onto some stuff, but I didn't even see it from that point of view. I was still partying and having a good time. But I think as a choice, a lot of times people feel like, well, I have a choice. I gotta just do this. It's like, no, you don't. You do the opposite. You can always do the opposite. You don't always have to follow what everybody else is doing. But I think the parents generationally, they always want us to do better the next one. And then I want to feel the same way about the next one. I want them to be degenerate. I want them to be good and go to school to do the things that I didn't do. Connie was talking about the community and education. I was always in the middle because I couldn't focus all the way on education, because then if I'm too focused, I'm selfish. And if I'm too selfish, then I ain't helping somebody else in our community. And that could take away. So I was trying to find the balance of like, what's the proper thing to do. And it's a constant struggle. It ain't gonna every day be a black and white simple answer. And that's the struggle that we have with every generation.
So
one to the other.
Michael just now talked about how the previous generation always wants the younger generation to do better. And there are many now who feel that that may not be the case with upcoming generations, that the opportunities for advancement are not what they were before.
That's true.
And there are lots of barriers. And I wonder, what do you think about that? Connie, what do you think about
I think that this is certainly a time of turmoil and sort of the breaking of a lot of molds. You know, Mike, I really liked your conversation about generations. You know, I was asked to address the Washington High School student body last year for I was nominated to be on the Hall of Merit. You know, that these are alumni, and there were several of us who are designated for that year, you know, go to the senior assembly, and we're supposed to address the students. And I thought, what am I going to tell these students? And this was the first assembly in 2 years after COVID, you know, and they were so excited. And I look at the audience, and when I was at Washington High School, we were the only Chinese in our neighborhood. I mean, even though I'm just talking about the Richmond, even though it was a very diverse school, but I look at this audience, and it's most largely Asian. and yeah, largely aged. So I thought, what am I going to tell them? And then also they have gone through so much. This generation has gone through a lot during the pandemic. Everything has been challenged and they've had to learn on Zoom. You know, a lot of kids dropped out. So I just said, one thing you're not going to learn that much from textbooks anymore. You're going to learn from your experiences, and you must learn from the experiences of previous generations. So everything that I've done has come from motivation I've gotten from oral history, interviewing other people. So I said, talk to your parents, talk to your grandparents, talk to your uncles and aunts, ask them what they've gone through. How did they get through these times? How did they survive? How did they make it through? And I said, I assure you, you will have much more depth on what you can do yourself. So that was my thought.
Sure.
And I did begin by the fact that I learned from oral history about institutionalized racism. I didn't know about, I mean, my grandfather had to carry a paper saying that he was legitimately in the United States as a laborer from the Geary Act. And I learned from my grandmother that she was detained on Angel Island because being Chinese.
So that's early racial profiling in both cases.
Early racial profile that affected a whole generation. And people say, why are the Chinese so silent? They're just the silent minority. We were not silent, we were silenced and terrorized, and communities were driven out. I mean, in the 1870s and 80s, up and down the coast, every single Chinatown experienced a state of siege, like Tacoma, Seattle, San Jose, where the Chinatowns were burned to the ground. And how did that affect the next generation? How did that affect, how did the exclusion law, which lasted for 61 years, how did that affect people's thinking? White Americans thinking about Asians. They are perpetual aliens. And the same thing with what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II, racial profiling. The majority of them were American-born citizens. They were all put into 10 relocation camps or concentration camps throughout the United States.
Was there an attempt to do the same with Chinese Americans? It's interesting that
No. The U.S. and China
escaped that fate.
Because the U.S. and China were allies. And that's the cause of repeal. This is the thing, people must know history. At one time, US and China were fighting allies. They were united, the flags were together, and the Chinese exclusion law was repealed in 1943. And this was after Madam Chiang Kai-shek was the second woman to address US Congress and to appeal for,
that was when she was still on mainland China?
Yes.
Before going to the island of Formosa.
Of course. Of
Yes.
course. That didn't happen until the 1950s,
Yes.
So the history is really important. And now, so it's very important that we know about the history of the US and China relations, because what is happening now is that China is being vilified.
Now, some would say for cause, taking Americans' technology, they're accused of stealing America's technology.
There's a difference between that politically and, the people. So what we don't want is the racial profiling here. Like, go back to where you came from. You guys are the enemy. So.
Yeah, Connie, if I could just add on to that, I think you make a really good point about distinguishing between political conversations and conversations that affect real people. Because I don't think I mentioned this, but I am here in Tonga, the Kingdom of Tonga, in the Pacific region. And a lot of the conversations that are happening here around foreign affairs is to create solutions that are combating some of the foreign matters that regard Chinese and US governance. And we have to be very careful, especially with the Smith-Mundt Act that was just amended in 2013, that is now allowing the State Department to discuss matters of foreign affairs to the domestic public. How do we go about that when there are large communities in America that identify as Chinese, that identify as Asian American? I don't know if our government is ready to have those very honest conversations. If their primary touch point is the diaspora communities, I think there's going to be a lot of healing and a lot of transparency that's going to need to happen in order for solutions and more informed strategies that beyond the U.S. borders. That can
Connie,
take
are you familiar with that law that Tonga Victoria is just talking about? What
Just
is it
not
again?
really, no, yeah.
So it's
I'm
the
excited
Smith-Mundt
about it.
Act, otherwise known as the U.S. Educational Exchange and Information Act, that was
Mhm.
passed in 1948
Oh, yeah.
to ban dissemination of government-sponsored materials to the domestic public for fear of propagandizing the American people.
Yes. Yes.
Is anything more to be said about that?
Well, it's
Well,
just
still
that
going, yeah.
during the, in the 70s, Everett Younger, the Attorney General of California, issued a report that went to all the police departments saying, watch out for Chinese triads, because the Chinese have they have associations that are would lead to Tong wars, and
Ah,
it was really so that's the kind of policy, or image that can be implemented into law enforcement. It's really a frightening thing.
sure. Yuki, you were shaking your head a few minutes back when we were talking about parents and younger generations. Did you have any comments then, or comments on anything discussed since that time?
Oh, I have well, to address the first point that you were talking about, I felt like in that moment we just kept on traipsing a little around the term, the sort of the American dream, which, from my my parents' like immigration story, which was, and like going back to another point where when we were talking about sort of manufactured things, which the American dream is sort of this manufactured idea that a lot of immigrants, not just Asian immigrants, are sort of like fed into as when they come to America for like these so-called like great opportunities. When, until they come here and realize that, the American dream is just not real. It's just non-existent. And I mean, there's so much that was said, onwards, for me personally, coming from the Northern Mariana Islands, with such a huge military presence historically, and that the Northern Mariana Islands played a big role in the Asia Pacific theater during World War II. The US military just continues to operate as its main base just because of how close it is in proximity to both North Korea and China. And so, I mean, growing up, I remember just thinking about how when North Korea would do a missile test, we had sort of drills in schools. It's sort of what would happen if such a thing were to happen, just because the US claimed the Northern Mariana Islands as US soil. And so, I mean, to Tonga's point, it's just these are sort of things that affect real people and the lives of so many people in the Pacific region.
Sure. Michael, any thoughts?
Well, I think part of it is, in my experience now, is how to relate to all the cultures here in the States. It's like a buffet of cultures. You know what I mean? You got all kinds of stuff going on. You just drive down El Camino, in Mountain View, Palo Alto. You have all these different restaurants. When I was a kid, it was like two things. You could either acculturate or assimilate. And so acculturate is you bring your culture and you just flow with however, you ain't trying to adapt to whatever they doing. And then assimilate is like, well, this is how they're doing it. Let's just copy them. And so I think a lot of times our island people was trying to figure out our lane because we're still a small, as far as how it is in the Bay Area, but it's growing. People are seeing us in the NFL. They're seeing us in WWE wrestling. So our vision is it's coming out, but still there's still this insular part where it's almost like nobody gets to see this, the secrets. The Chinese people.
Well, you know,
yeah. So
it's always acceptable for communities of color to excel in sports,
yeah,
to excel in music.
yeah, and or in Hollywood, you know, and films.
Yes.
So
Yes.
historically, we've been going through our own spit rocky up and down Bay areas, the laws, the police, you know what I mean? They still shoot at us, you know, like there was a story of 3 Samoan guys who were shot in Los Angeles back in the 90s during the Rodney King time. Mistaken identity. I mean, they shot one guy 13 times, another time 11. And we had to deal with that. Our community, the law comes in, does whatever they got to do. And then later on, it's so hard to acquit a cop. We done seen the history. I ain't making this up. And then we're the
You mean
community.
to convict the cop?
Even that too, add that there. And so we're sitting there trying to heal the community. Meanwhile, the law just keeps on going and just keeps doing what they're doing. And, you know, this is why there's such a push for education so that some of these things can change, or voting, as people talk about. But what can we do as people in our lane? I can't do everything, but I know what I'm good at. And hopefully you all know what you're good at and what you can do in your community. And this is why that we have a conversation.
Well, I guess that's the question that we've come to at this point. What is there that needs to be done? And how can we do it? Is there light at the end of the tunnel or light in the tunnel? What are some of the answers, some of the solutions?
You know, it seems like every day I get more and more discouraged that there is any light, because more and more history has come out. You know, a couple of years ago, we all learned about Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I
Yes.
never knew about Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Yes.
And I was so horrified. And then recently, the massacre in Florida, the town in Florida, that the residents still celebrate the day, you know, that their ancestors had gone through this terrible massacre, the destruction of their community that had been hidden for generations to other people outside the community. And suddenly we learn about that. And I go, it's been there for so long. We didn't know about it. What else are we going to find? Because every day we see, you know, the shootings and the massacre, more and more killings and police profiling, horrible things. And we just know, well, in the past, it was on a huge scale, and here it's surfacing again. So what encourages me as far as personally is the people that I work with, the coalitions that I have. I was thrilled when the group that I was involved with, Chinese for Affirmative Action, a couple of years ago, we just, you know, issued the statements, you know, we stand with Black Lives Matter, and even the Chinese Historical Society issued statements that we stand together. And I was just on a Zoom meeting with the AAPI activist historical oral history group that got a grant from the county, Santa Clara County, to study this history of activism of Asian Americans, you know, AAPI. And it is, even though we say AAIP, we say we stand with all the groups that have gone through racial profiling, terrorism, that hidden history that we we are responsible for bringing to the surface now, so we can enact change, because you can't go forward unless you look back. Oh, that's a long statement, but anyway.
No, it's very, very important. And it makes me think of the backlash. um, that's always there. And the fact that the group stands with Black Lives Matter could make you targeted. Or accused of socialism, or of undermining the values of this country.
Well, for the group itself, we feel that's the only way we can consider ourselves part of humanity.
Yes. Michael, what do you see on the horizon in terms of the light? Where is it for you?
Well, here's something different. My Pacific Islander people are primarily Christian, but I am a Buddhist, and I am connected to these temples, and I've seen directly the relationship when we're practicing belief or faith or whatever you want to call it, like-minded people. And I look to my side, and there's a Japanese person. I look to my left or right, there's a Chinese person. And so we started developing conversation, small, like just have a cup of coffee at Starbucks and just talk a little bit about, so those little moments were adding up to where I am now. And so I keep doing that. I think conversations that we can have, one teacher explained it as two people having a conversation that has no aggression or violence is enlightened society. A society that sees a different angle, that does not have to continue on with aggression and violence that's been happening in this country for many years before the Plymouth Rock and all of that. And so small moments, those are what that I could do. And keeping in touch with the arts. I felt like I saw a lot of artwork at the Asian Art Museum one year when I was in San Francisco. And I saw the history that you talk about. And to also acknowledge it, and to also remember, you can't really have a tree without the roots. And so looking back and having those conversations, and even checking out some of those. I was a big fan of Korean films and films from China, and also reading up on history, but also just being kind to one another. I think that could be a small thing that I could do. That's probably, as Michael Jackson say, I'm starting with the man in the mirror. So
Yuki, where is the light for you? Is
I
it
think I truly believe that the light is here. And I think tying it back to what Connie said earlier is just learning about these oral histories. I mean, for me personally, I work part-time at Tufts University's Asian American Center, and this year we celebrate 40 years since the center's founding. And the center was founded as a result of student activism after a hate crime happened on campus from a fraternity. And so we sort of did this art exhibit where we explored the history and the timeline of activism that happened in the creation of the center, and tie it to today and what the future is and what we hope for the center to look like in 40 years from now. And so when I think about these small oral histories, these histories of sort of like what's not really what's being resurfaced, or these little histories of that's not captured in the mainstream, I see a sort of hope and light for the future, that we are documenting ourselves, we're documenting our past, and sharing it for people in the future to learn from, like, people just like them.
amazing? Tonka Victoria, where is the light for you?
Sure. As someone who is of the diaspora and living here in the homeland of my ancestors, my parents, being around my heritage has been the light for me and light for my family. And I know as a young person seeking for this type of nourishment that I couldn't find in the classroom, was I could find it somewhat within the community, but because we were so distant and so far away from our land of heritage, it was really difficult for me to understand who I was. So I dealt with a lot of identity crisis, and I think I can speak as just a general observation on our culture today.
Now, I want to make it clear that you're right now in Tonga.
In Tonga, yes.
Yes.
You are.
Yes, she's
Yeah.
in Tonga and
Yeah,
Yuki's in Boston and
Yeah. And so for me, the light for the next generation is really building a spotlight on this pathway from identity crisis to identity capital, and having heritage, or at least um, a digital place for heritage to live, is something that I am invested in as part of my work, as part of my master's program. And so I'm really excited to kind of invest my time and my energy in hopefully bringing that light into the tunnel. I don't know how long this tunnel is, but we can just bring some of that light inside. Yeah, that's definitely worth investing in, committing towards.
it's interesting where that light can be, whether it's at the end of the tunnel, whether it exists at all, and how it can be brought into the tunnel. It seems that we're all in agreement that there's the light. There's the light someplace.
There's the light, and I love what you said, Tonga, Victoria, because the light is actually energy, you know, and I consider all of this, like this discussion, and you know, you're talking about the work that you've done, and also, you know, remembering your ancestors. I think this is all part of activism. It's all part of resistance. We resist the violence. We resist the terrorism and the racism, and we're doing something about it, you know, in our own way. Because, you know, what has inspired me about when I read history is there are incidents of people who just stand up and say this is wrong, who just absolutely just put themselves on the line, and we learn from that. And it's well, my son's named Martin after Martin Luther King, you know, so you know, it's always been that example to me of a great man who had a dream. So we continue that.
Sure, it's a dream, I guess, in another way, perhaps. It's an American dream, is it? Not manufactured, but in real life.
We have to claim it. We have to claim it that it is. It's not recognized as an American dream because people of color have always felt outside of it. So we have to
is
reclaim
that
it.
something? I'm so sorry, Connie. Is that something, Yuki, that you would go along with as a new definition for the American dream?
Yeah, definitely.
Would that work for you, Michael?
Well, you know, it still lives on, the things that Dr. King said. So it didn't really stop or get stagnated. It just transformed, and each generation sees it a different way. And so, you know, I see it as opportunity and the ability. And sometimes I talk to my foreign friends. I ask them, like, ain't nobody going. Who wants to go to a country where you're gonna get beat up and be selected out? Nobody got on the boat and said, I want to go there where my grandchildren could go to prison, just to use an absurd example. They didn't come here for that. And I asked my parents, like, they came for opportunity. They wanted to get a better life and things like that. And along the way, there was all this. So that was that thing that Dr. King talked about. I see, you know, children of different races and things coming together. Sometimes it's whatever circumstances it's going to happen, but it happens, and I've seen it with my own two eyes.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you because I think this is a great way of ending our discussion, talking about the light, how you each see it, and a new definition of the American dream and how we can pass that new definition on from generation to generation and take from previous generations to give to future generations. So I'd like to thank all of you for being here with me. And
It's been wonderful
your
talking to all of
thoughts.
you.
Yes, Connie.
I was saying, it's been wonderful talking to all of you and hearing your stories, and I feel strangely empowered. How's that?
Yes, so do I. In spite of what was looks like the chaos,
Exactly,
the
exactly.
chaotic times. So,
Thank
so
you.
thank you all very, very much. It's been a joy to be here to talk with you.